As we sang that song, I thought about a chain that's been broken off of my life that I'm really thankful for. How many of you, whether you had heard it or not, believed in your previous faith experiences that if the preacher said it, you had to believe it? That's a chain. And I don't know that I ever verbally heard it spoke, but I'll never forget when I first came out. The first church I went to was a UCC church in Oklahoma City, and the preacher, it was Christmas time, and he made a comment that I did not agree with. I popped right up out of that chair, and I was headed out the door. And if I've ever heard the Spirit of God speak to me, God said, sit down. I never said you had to agree with everything the preacher said. So I want you to be free. Like many of you coming into this sexuality, spirituality thing, I liked the graphic. Thought it was really cool. But I didn't know where we were getting ourselves into. But you know what I've experienced, at least so far, is if nothing else, the freedom to be authentic and to be real and to talk about things that were taboo in church. That's a chain. That is a chain that many of us grew up in an environment that said sexuality or your body or all those things are bad. But spirituality looks like this. Break every chain. In Jesus' name. So be free tonight. I may say something you disagree with. I may say something that makes you go, oh, God. You might pop up and want to run out of here, and I pray the Spirit of God tells you to sit back down, because you don't have to listen to what the preacher says or believe anything. Join with me, if you would. I'm going to read from the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. While Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law of Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. Now what do you say? They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. But Jesus just bent down, with his finger wrote on the ground. And when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing there before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She said, No one, sir. And Jesus said, Neither do I condemn you. Go on your way and strive to sin no more. As we enter this evening's conversation about don't be a glute, first thing I want to do is I want to thank Catherine for last week's message. It was so powerful. It was so vulnerable. Her vulnerability to share her own struggle with the previous week's topic I thought was just a amazing gift from God. And how she processed that and her willingness to ask questions about the things she had never heard of before or discussed in her personal journey. I wish you all could have been in the room when the conversation happened earlier that day. She and I are sitting there talking, and Jim pops in the door, and we're like, Tell us about your message. He goes, Well, I'm going to talk about tricking. And she said, Did you say drinking? The puzzled look on her face as he clarified the word, and she said, What is that? And the explanation unfolded, and she said, Why would anyone want to do that? The beautiful thing was, excuse me, there was never a sense of any judgment in her question. It would have been easier probably to have just dismissed the topic as wrong, based on her life experience or understanding of sexual relationships, but she chose to engage the discomfort, ask more questions, and grew from the experience and then shared that experience with us. Have you ever wondered, when reading or hearing the story about the woman caught in adultery, we all know the title, how did these men know for sure she was committing adultery? Valid question. Did they have a nanny cam in her house? Were they peering through the window like a bunch of creepers? Or did they make assumptions when they saw a married woman or man talking with someone that wasn't their spouse? I think the story should be known as the day Jesus confronted the judgmental. Like I said, I wasn't sure where this series was going, but I'm so grateful that we took a step of faith to help us all realize that we are fully human, fully connected to divine, fully able to talk about things that make us a little uncomfortable and process it together. But let me ask you this. Do you ever find yourself ever making assumptions about sexuality, spirituality, about yourself or others? If you say no, I'm going to question if you're telling the truth. A couple of years ago, Paul and I were at the gym working out. I'm just going to be authentic here. We both looked at each other as this guy was working out on the other side of the room. I believe we'll have a picture here. We were speechless. Just going to be honest. Even a straight man would find him attractive. He had a very unique look. Obviously, he was physically defined. He had this hat on backwards and this intense look on his face. It appeared he was working out arms and legs that day, because I'm just going to say it. He walked by, and his glutes were huge. I was like, oh my God. But to break the silence, I said to Paul, don't stare too long. He looks like he might just kick your glutes for looking at him. Thanks to some personal work I had done by reading the book, The Four Agreements, I followed immediately up with, but I bet you know what? If I got to know him, he's probably a really nice guy. I didn't know anything about this person. I knew he was physically built, he looked tough, and then a few days later, I ran into him again at the gym. And I'll be honest, he was walking towards me, I was like a little nervous, and my God, there's that guy we were looking at. Made me uncomfortable. And he said, hi, my name is Josiah. Hi. And we stood there and talked for like 5 minutes. What do you do? What do you do? This, that. So on the conversation went. That next week, he Facebooked me, and we became Facebook friends, and I began to know a little bit more about him. But the cool thing was I realized that that initial assumption I made was absolutely wrong, and my follow-up statement ended up being absolutely true. He had all these posts, and he would get into these conversations with people and kind of debate and have all these things going on, and I just thought, this is really interesting. And as I'd run into him in the community and different things I'd learned, oh, he's a go-go dancer. Okay. Dances for local clubs and charity events and even travels around the country dancing. Don't be afraid. He was going to be here tonight, but I asked permission to share the story, but he couldn't be here. I later learned he works in the professional industry of adult entertainment and film. Woo, Lord. But as I'd read more of his posts, and at initial glance I might think, oh, his life's diametrically different than mine, I was intrigued because of the logic he would use in these conversations. Oh, he would say things about, I'm not into organized religion and have, things to say about it, but you would hear this undercurrent of spirituality and depth. Didn't care for organized religion, the greed of the American and other countries' economies discussed him, continually challenging conventional thought on topics. And although I may not agree with everything he says or does, what I found was this great appreciation for his self-awareness, his bold, authentic living, and his lack of concern for the judgments of anyone else. I told him one day, I'd like to visit with you and possibly have you share at my church about your views on religion, sexuality, etc. That made us both nervous. But we met and we had coffee. And I got to hear his story. Here are some of the aspects of his journey that I had no idea or would have never assumed. Grew up in a very small town, graduated with 28 people, and being biracial, experienced firsthand the deep, hateful sin of racism, even from school teachers, and yet remains the jovial, funny, little bit ornery person. Enjoys life. Although he's not interested in organized religion, he was the leader of his youth group in his Baptist church that he grew up in and attended church all through his teenage years. He graduated from Stephen F. Austin University with a major in philosophy and a minor in economics and plans to pursue his graduate studies someday. He served in the Marine Corps Reserves through college because he wanted to serve, and he also wanted to be more disciplined, knowing that college might be a challenge. He was a founding member and one of the leaders that established his fraternity's charter at his university. And yes, he may be non-traditional, but I'm here to tell you he's a deeply spiritual human being. My point here is, had I assumed that he was a mean-spirited, tough guy that would rather beat you up than look at you, I would have been so wrong. Had I assumed he was uneducated, a wild party man with no ambition because certain religious perceptions often project people in his line of work are such, I would have been so far off. Had I assumed he was unspiritual just because he approaches his faith in some different ways than maybe I do, I would have been completely out of touch with the truth. And I'm so glad that, like Catherine did last week, instead of being afraid or intimidated or scared to talk, I chose to ask some questions. Just assume that I really didn't know anything. I have another friend who has a very open relationship with his partner, and he posts all kinds of revealing and sexual things on his Facebook page, and they even make me a little uncomfortable. And he shares these thoughts with great boldness and lack of concern what anybody else thinks. And we were hanging out one day, and he's like, I'm going to check us in. You know, Facebook, we check in. No big deal. Next Sunday, some older gentleman of our church came up to me and said, oh, saw you were with so-and-so. I said, yeah, he's a good friend of mine. I knew where this conversation was going. This person got this really judgmental look on their face and literally pointed a finger at me and said, oh, I know all about him. Did you have fun? Knowing what he's implying, I said, you bet. We always have fun when we hang out. His mouth puckered up a little bit more, and he just kind of grunted, mm-hmm. And I said, if you're implying that there's anything sexual going on between me and my friend, you should be ashamed of yourself. He walked away. Why do we tend to make these assumptions so quickly? Especially about anything sexual. Is it because of our own insecurities? Is it because we've transferred certain aspects of our judgmental theology into our semi-inclusive culture? Is it just because it's plain easier to assume than to ask questions and engage someone who's different than you and me? I wish I could express in words sometimes the absolute joy it is to serve as a pastor in this church. No, it's not easy, and yes, we have days where you're like, really, Jesus? But for the most part, it is an unexplainable joy. I get to sit and walk this journey with people. In the last 2 months, I've had 5 different conversations, 5 different calls, or people who have visited from other states that are married men with children. And because the Cathedral of Hope is here, they read our biographies and they said, I can probably talk to him. I'm getting to walk with these men. Not telling them what to do or not to do, but just let them know they're not the only one. To let them know that everyone in the conservative bubble that's telling them, don't go to the dark side if you just pray harder, and I've been praying my whole life. To show them that you can be gay and Christian, that you can be sexual and spiritual, and to just see the heaviness lift off of them, even for a moment, is such a gift. One man came to me one day and said, different scenario, but Todd, I'm doubly cursed. I said, what are you talking about? He said, I'm attracted to older men. I have been since I was a teenager. So I'm not only gay, but I'm not a normal gay. I'm only attracted to older men. He felt such shame, and he said, would you go out with me one night? And I went with him, and there's a certain bar that has a patio where older gentlemen hang out. Who knew? And when we walked in there with him, it was an amazing experience to see him just be himself. He talked about the judgments he had from gays. Oh, he's just a gold digger. Oh, he this, oh, he that. But seldom do people ever take time to stop and get to know him, talk to him. How about some of the stuff you see on TV these days? Anybody seen My 5 Wives? Anyone seen that show? I mean, I don't watch it. I just was flipping through the channel, but I'm telling you, it caught my attention. And I found myself a little critical, and all of a sudden I was like, I don't know that person's journey. Oh, but the Bible says marriage should look like that. Really? You want to talk about the biblical definition of marriage? That's a whole other sermon. I recently married a straight couple. But they have a polyamorous, make sure I say this correctly, polyamorous relationship. I still have questions. We're going to meet later because I have some more questions to ask. Catherine was so cute that day. After Jim walked out, she goes, I have so much to learn. During the month of June, I'm going to put a little plug in here for a class, but during the month of June on Tuesdays, I'm going to lead a class on the 4 agreements. If you've ever had a session or conference or meeting with me, I probably have either told you to get the book or given you a copy because this book changed my life and continually does. And so on Tuesdays for 4 weeks, if you haven't been through the book or would like to do it again, I invite you to join me. And here's a quote from the author in the chapter on the agreement called Make No Assumptions. He says, if others tell us something, we make assumptions. And if they don't tell us something, we make assumptions to fulfill our need to know and to replace the need to communicate. Even if we hear something and we don't understand, we make assumptions about what it means and then believe the assumptions. We make all sorts of assumptions because we don't have the courage to ask questions. I wonder what the men who brought the woman before Jesus would have learned had they been courageous enough to ask her, how do you know this man? I wonder, even if she had sinned, missed the mark, didn't make maybe the best decision, had they learned more about her life journey if they would have been so quick to call for her punishment? Or maybe if they'd have just faced their own fears and insecurities and done a little bit of personal work, would they have been so quick to assume they were justified in their judgments? I wonder if they had engaged the man and woman in a conversation, maybe they would have walked away before Jesus exposed them for being the glutes that they were. Ellen DeGeneres once said on her show, you should never assume. You know how you spell assume? She said, you never want to do it. Because when you assume, you make up out of me and you. That's how it's spelled, she said. Walk in courage, my friends. And whatever you do, don't be a glute. Amen.